Hey, what's going on, boxing history fans? Thank you for bearing with us. We are here. We are live. Another edition of, I guess you can call it, boxing history every night. I've said it before. While it may not be every night, at least every week, we get to talk a little boxing history, and it's always great. So everyone is appreciated for sure. Wednesday, we no longer really get Wednesday night fights in the same capacity that we used to. So it's good to have something that we can latch on to. In this case, of course, we're going to be talking boxing history, some of the greats that are out there in history. Real quick, you see right here on the sweatshirt, of course, the great Jack Blackburn. This is a shirt I designed. It even has the QR code right here. And with that QR code, you can scan and actually go see the video on the channel that is tied to the great Jack Blackburn. But that being said, today we are here to talk about Jimmy Britt. Now, this is a fighter I'd imagine not a ton of people may know him, but that being said, he's someone you might want to get to know. I will say that. And I don't really know a ton from an overall perspective, but I was happy that I didn't have to do this by myself because, as you can see in the title and on the screen here, I did bring on a special guest, none other than the man himself, Random Acoustic Thoughts, who is going to help us with breaking down the career of this top-notch fighter that is one Jimmy Britt. And he is someone that I think you'll take a great interest in because it's one of those names that is likely oft forgotten these days. As a matter of fact, I've even done some videos on the channel that featured opponents of Jimmy Britt, and I don't recall in full totality if I even mentioned Jimmy Britt. Now, that could have been sort of a misnomer, but that being said, now that I think about it and look back, he should have been mentioned. So that's on me right there. But, to correct the issue, I'm here, and we're going to do it live here tonight. Boxing history, baby. And with that, welcome to the special guest, of course, as mentioned, none other than Random Acoustic Thoughts. And right now, go and check out his channel. Go subscribe. Be sure to like videos, actually watch the videos. If you're into boxing history, that's the key thing right there. You actually look at or listen to the videos. I often find myself just listening to them there as I'm trying to hear some of the different things that transpire with some of the individuals that he covers there. So welcome, Random Acoustic Thoughts, man. It's a pleasure to have you here. Always a treat. And I appreciate you taking the time to bless the channel with your presence once again there, buddy.
Oh, big up, 86. How you doing, brother?
Hey, I'm hanging in there, just dealing with the day-to-day as it comes about. But boxing history tends to bring a bit of joy as it relates to, managing what's going on here real time in life. A lot going on for sure. But, hey, we got boxing history we can always tie back to and think about, hey, they had some pretty hard times back in those days for sure.
Yeah, those some tough characters. I'm liking that shirt right there. Where's the store? Tell the people, tell the folks at home where they can get one of those.
Now, this is through Spread Shop. Now, I designed it myself, and I wanted to go with sort of an infusion of the real deal versus what a modern look would be like right here. So I went with the half and half. You can call it half and half. Just consider this the Arnie Palmer of boxing history shirts right here. But, yeah, you can get it on the channel. As a matter of fact, it will be scrolling across the bottom, I suppose, because there's a shop connected. But it's certainly the Spread Shop. 86 Boxing Spread Shop. Check that out. And, hey, there's a couple of other ones on there as well featuring John L. Sullivan, which you can see right here where my thumb is. John L. Sullivan, as well as Kid Blackie himself, Jack Dempsey. So appreciate you taking the time there, Random.
That's what up, man. Now we need one for Laughing Sam Langford.
Hey, you know what?
Yeah, I got a graphic for you. I'll send you a graphic. You do a number on it. But I like that one right there, man. Jack Blackburn, one of the hardest men that ever stepped in the ring. He was.
Yes,
in and out of the
indeed.
ring. He was an actual hard man, you know, maybe to his detriment, but he sure knew how to fight.
And I have a video on the channel, and the thumbnail says hardest boxer ever. So you are very correct there, Random. So no, hey, you're on point per usual, of course.
Fun fact: for the folks that don't know, I'm writing a book on Sam Langford's first 7 seasons of boxing, and
Hey,
the
I don't
first
think
time
the
they
folks
fought.
knew. I don't think the folks knew that, Random. So appreciate you sharing that here. So you heard it here, folks. Random Acoustic Thoughts is working on a book.
Shameless self-promotion, naturally, but the first time Blackburn fought Sam Langford, right after Langford had beaten the great Joe Gans, Blackburn had already gotten the best of Gans himself in a 6-rounder, no decision, but he actually got the best of Langford and ganked to fight off him. Langford had been booked after he beat Gans to fight Mike Twin Sullivan, who's a famous boxer from New England. And after Blackburn, they had a prearranged draw, but Blackburn got the best of him in the Chelsea club, hijacked the booking from Langford and gave it to Blackburn, and they fought instead at the end of the year, at the end of 1903. Little fun fact there that's in the book. One of many weird things that happened in the book in Langford's career. I found a lot of fights that were booked that didn't end up happening, or the opponent got switched. That's all in there too. I decided instead of a record at the back of the book, a detailed record, I'm going to do a booking record, including fights that didn't happen and what happened to them. So it's going to be like the Sam Langford handbook here, 1902 to 1907. Unfortunately, he didn't get to fight Jimmy Britt. Jimmy Britt was drawing the color line a lot. And then when he stopped, it was for Gans because that was a big money fight. Jimmy Britt was a money fighter. There was a lot of money. His family had some wealth and affluence, so he didn't have to fight in between the big fights. And he actually had a little bit of an amateur career. I was looking today, just digging, because I don't know a whole ton about Britt, but I've looked him up. And so he was an amateur in the 1901 season. He had 3 fights. He won them all. And at the Olympic Club in San Francisco, he was a San Francisco guy. And but he would spend, rather than fighting in between, he had a little amateur thing, and I saw the papers saying that might inspire kids to go that way to polish up the skills. This is before it was a given you would have an amateur run normally. So that was like they were saying, oh, you know, this is a great way to bring up champions. Have some amateur fights. I mean, Langford had a few amateur fights himself, but Brits were more of a big deal. He had the full-throated backing of a club, and he had money behind him already. So, but he turned pro in 02 and beat a guy, Toby Irwin, in February. But then later that month, he beat Tim Hegarty, who was like Australian champion. I think he claimed the lightweight championship of Australia. Had a good record, though. If you look at BoxRec, 31-1-8 by their measure, at least. And he stopped him in 8 rounds. So that was like sort of put him, he was already on the map when he turned pro, because again, he had backing, but that one was a pretty good statement. He was a little bit of a favorite in that fight, but he did win it. And he stopped his man with the most important thing. And this is so between that and his next fight in May, because I think he beat, I think it was just after the Gans. So Gans beat Frank Aaron, the lightweight champion, so became the first colored lightweight champion, the first American, you know, colored champion to be undisputed. And so, but right after that, I think it was later in May, Britt, who started claiming the white lightweight championship, but also drawing the color line, so he didn't want to unify at first. But he beat Kid Levine, the former lightweight champion, stopped him too. Levine was a little bit older, but that's another good win. That's part adding to his acclaim. Haven't stopped the champion.
And let's hold it there real quick, Random, because that is pretty freaking amazing right there. And I'm gonna bring up a actual graphic that shows the notable fights of one Jimmy Britt, so you can see it there on the screen, folks. But that being said, I did want to take a little time to kind of touch on the 2 opponents you've mentioned thus far, Tim Hegarty and George Kid Levine. Of course, you probably heard George Kid Levine, its name at least, among other fighters, but certainly Barbados Joe Walcott. As a matter of fact, one of the only, I believe maybe the only actual video footage of Barbados Joe Walcott doing an interview is one where he actually brings up George Kid Levine in that video. But Tim Hegarty, I wanted to start on there real quick, Random, because I recall us actually discussing him beforehand. A lot of his work took place in Australia. Now, he did have some fights here in the U.S., as a matter of fact. he had a handful. Looks like it's around 8 fights that took place in the U.S., but a lot of these guys can be somewhat unassuming. And we know, I know, of course, Random, that Australia, it is one of those spots that played a major role in the sport of boxing during this time frame. And we've seen some of the shine of Australia even here right now to this very day. Of course, they have stars and things, but just thinking about it from that time frame, when you take into account things such as the Australian Heavyweight Championship, etc., there were a ton of fighters that played a significant role in Australians. They were primetime players in the sport. But this guy, Tim Haggerty, he was the Australian featherweight champion, I want to note, as well as Australian lightweight champion. So he was putting in work there in Australia. And he just so happens to have a win over Aurelio Herrera. As a matter of fact, he fought Aurelio Herrera on a couple of different occasions. That was sort of stand out for me, just seeing that. Because if you know Herrera, he was a guy who put in a lot of work there in and around the lightweight division during those particular periods. And someone who made some big waves for a world title, but he was right there at that elite level. So this Haggerty, it was like an introduction for me there when you actually mentioned him, Random.
Yeah, he was good. I mean, he wasn't the favorite against Britt, but again, he was powerful. He was a good hitter. He was a full, able to train full time. And I think I saw in the paper today, but I worked all day. I didn't have time to chase it down. But I saw an interview that said, I guess he had sparred his brother and beat him up. His brother manager, Willie Britt, but he had been a fighter. And so I guess maybe he was passing on the tools to his younger brother, who was a real hard hitter. Britt could punch. Like, some of his fights did go distance, but a lot of these fighters he was fighting were extremely good. They weren't guys you could just put out. But at this time, it's worth noting that for 20-round bouts, I think there's a siren in the back. Can you hear that on your end? Sorry about it.
No, you're good.
Oh, cool. But shoot, I lost my train of thought. Darn it, siren.
Oh yeah, it's all good. We were talking.
Oh, yeah, him and his brother. So like they were saying that he had been a boxer, so he basically trained full time. He came in, he had a lot of swagger, and he didn't have to fight for titles. Like, he was a money earner. So even though he didn't have a lot of fights, but he was earning a ton of money every fight, or most of these fights. And that would have been true of Haggerty and also Kid Levine. But Haggerty beating Herrera. Herrera's a legit guy. He made a lot of noise there. Just not everyone makes noise for a bunch of years in a row, like a Gans or a Walcott or Langford. Britt's a little like that, but he was considered a top 2 lightweight in the world at one point with Joe Gans, along with Joe Gans. So, what's up, Rodolfo?
That is saying something right there for sure there, Random. Yeah, real quick, shout out to Rodolfo Rivera Jr. Always appreciate you dropping by there, buddy. Be sure to show some love to Rodolfo. Be sure to show some love to my man, Dan the man. He says, hey, brother Josh. Hey, appreciate you there, Dan. Always good to have you in the mix. And Dan says every fight he ever had is against great fighters all time. I think about 100 fights got lost in record keeping. Oh yeah, there are those cases for sure from those particular time frames and periods where the fighter records are not necessarily fully complete, despite what you see on BoxRec and such. Some things just kind of got lost in the sauce. We even have situations where we know how easy it is to lose things here today when we have so many means of keeping up with such. But yeah, it's not out of the realm of possibility, and it's not a rarity that, of course, what we see is not the full details of what may have went down as far as all of the fights some of these great warriors competed in.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember what I was saying before, which was that California was where you could get 20-round fights.
Oh, yeah.
In and around this time. It may have not been consistently like the whole time, but there was a point early in the century where it was, if you wanted 20-rounders, California was the place. They had the big crowds.
A great promoter out of there from this time frame, Tom McCary, and I know he was known for hosting events, and there were usually 20-rounders plus out there in California. I want to say he was in that Colma area, San Francisco, one of the two, somewhere in there.
Yeah, Colma was there are a lot of big fights that ended up happening out there. So basically Britt, because I think he might have actually been a featherweight as an amateur, but he was up close to the lightweight limit at the time, which was 133, maybe 130 this early in his career. But anyway, I could be wrong about that. But like he made statements, and then he had the backing. So the press, they wrote glowingly about this guy. But he was you couldn't say he was a regional fighter and that he wasn't fighting top level competition, but it would be like maybe certain other fighters of more modern times. Someone might think about that's like they only fight in Vegas, or there's only a couple cities you can find him fighting for one reason or another, often money. And Britt was a little bit like that. He was going to be fighting out in California mostly and on the West Coast because he could get gigantic paydays there. And so fighters were trying to go fight him. Mm-hmm. So at one point you had, after he beat Frank Earn, the former lightweight champ, the same year that Gans had beaten him, toward the end of the year, he beat him. So now he's beaten two former lightweight champions. He's making a claim. People call him the white lightweight champion or the champion of the Pacific Coast. Some people would just straight up call him the champion because he was making the limit ringside or close to it. Whereas Gans, what they were saying about Gans at the time was that he could no longer make 133. So Britt was drawing the color line, and then when he lifted it, he said, well, I'll only fight you 133 ringside. But Gans did make weight. So, he sort of like put a spear through that myth. But that was sort of the talking point as they were hyping Britt up. But he had the performances to back up his claim of at least being the top contender. Because he had, like Frank Ernie, that was his last fight in 1902. He made a pile of money that year, even though he only had 4 fights. But then he kicked off 1903. He actually got disqualified against Jack O'Keefe, although I think it was like he was beating him up. But then he would get a little bit overzealous at times. This cost him in some fights. Mm-hmm. And this happened in this. And so he got DQ'd and lost the fight. And they kind of held that against him in the press. So even after that, when he beats Willie Fitzgerald, a very, very good fighter at the time, 20 rounds. Again, this is at Mechanics Pavilion, but again in San Francisco. And he beats him on points 20 rounds, but they still bring up O'Keefe. So he rematches O'Keefe and they draw this time. And then for the rest of the year in November, he beats Charlie Seeger on points and Martin Cannoli from Fall River, Massachusetts, south of Boston. And he was undefeated at the time and had a lot of backing, like money, gamblers behind him. They went out to California, came home disappointed. But, that one, I think, went to distance 25 rounds. So at this time, it wasn't always that only title fights were longer, but title fights of meaning were expected to have a conclusion. Yeah, they booked a lot of rounds when they were able to. There were examples of fighters being matched. I think Young Corbett and Terry McGovern were trying to match. Rhode Island turned them down. Other states, certain states,
fighters right there for sure.
Yeah. Certain states you could box, but you couldn't have a championship fight. The champions. There were certain states around in the first few years of the century where the authorities wouldn't allow championship matches, but you could pull off boxing in general, which is weird, but it happened. And then, of course, every now and again, as happens in contact sports, fighters would die over time. It wasn't just, the cycling was dangerous, football was dangerous, baseball probably at times, but certainly a boxer would die, and then oftentimes that would result in some sort of crackdown regionally or locally. So they were always dealing with this. So certain fights that didn't happen, sometimes the circumstances just made it really difficult to pull it off. Other times people were avoiding or making demands that would make it impossible. But there's a lot of hypocrisy as well. Like, it's not just today where people say one thing and do something else. So according to the papers, at least, like Joe Gans, he was fighting above the limit, but for the title in a lot of them.
Yeah.
But
I think you see some of that today, even, in terms of, surrounding weight, etc.
Yeah, so like some of these fights, it was like a rehydration clause without the initial weigh-in. So you'd basically go ringside, you could have 5 pounds over the limit, but you had to make that weight and then go in and fight right afterwards. So that's how you could relate it to today. It's like a rehydration clause, but there's no initial weigh-in. Some of these things, sometimes they would weigh in the afternoon, though. It wasn't a rule that it was ringside, but people would use that sometimes. So like Joe Gans, even though he wanted to go fight on the other coast and they were talking about the weight thing, but he wouldn't fight New England's Patsy Sweeney, who was from New Hampshire, one of Langford's opponents. unless Sweeney could make 133 ringside, which Sweeney couldn't make. He was more like a 138, 140-pound fighter. So you'll see that where you have some double dealing. Gans didn't always have the same manager, so his manager in the early years of the century were very unpopular. Al Hereford, Baltimore was very unpopular. Lots of weight games, lots of this and that. So a lot of drama came up like that, but it wasn't just Gans. There were a lot of people doing that.
Hey, you know, in that weight clause situation, stipulation thing, hey, one of the great examples of that is, of course, Packy McFarland. There's a video on the channel of Packy McFarland. And Packy McFarland, he never fought for a world lightweight title, but weight was one of the issues in terms of, but in this case, he didn't want to boil down to 133 at one point, and you could say that hurt him. We know lightweight is 135 these days, but yeah, back then it was 133, and Packy McFarland, that's one of the things that hindered him from getting a shot at the world lightweight title. And it just so happens one of the opponents, though Gans was more towards the back end, was Joe Gans. Now, this one didn't happen, I think, more so because of timings, but battling Nelson at Wolgast, those were two that Packy didn't get to fight right there. And it's very interesting that factors in. Hold up, before we move on to there, Random, I wanted to pause for a sec. Because, you know, in going through the Jimmy Britt resume, and you mentioned these names, George Kid Levine, of course, George Kid Levine, I always tie him, can't help but tie him to Barbados Joe Walcott, especially when thinking about the actual interview that we have of Barbados Joe Walcott. But very solid fighter here, George Kid Levine, and he's one who stands out. You also mentioned Frank Earn. So Frank Erne, we've heard it different ways, but another great fighter, former world lightweight champion there out of Switzerland. And he's one of those that has a resume probably closer to one of the modern guys, a total of 53 bouts, that is. But that being said, very, very good fighter right there. I intend to do a video on him at some point on the channel. But that being said, that's who Joe Gans won his world light heavyweight title from. It was Frank Earn. So just think about the magnitude of the names. And when you look at it from a Jimmy Britt perspective, that was his fourth fight. So second fight, George Kid Levine. Third fight, George Kid Levine. Second fight, Frank Earn. So just think about that. That is absolutely insane. Two fights that are against
fourth fight,
two world champions, depending on how you source it, because Kid Levine, he fought for what was considered to be the world titles as well. So just think about that. All of that within the span of essentially 4 fights, you know, and that just shows you the levels and magnitudes of some of these fighters. A recent example we have of that, of course, is Vasily Lomachenko. Think about how it was when he actually fought for a title in his like second or third fight, one of the two. Just think about that. That's insane, right?
Yeah, it's totally bonkers. But you know, he was training full time. Apparently, he had family in the game, and he had good people handling and training him, and his brother manager, and so he had a lot of things going for him. There were other fighters who did as well. It wasn't just him, but he was perfectly positioned to make a ton of money, fight a bunch of big people, provided he could back up, you know, the hype, which he often did. I mean, he was a very good fighter indeed. And like after that good 1903, so toward the end of 1903, as you know, Gans had the worst of it in a fight in a 6th rounder with Blackburn, and then in a long fight with Sam Langford in Boston at the Criterion Club. Langford's big breakout fight. Although Langford had knocked out Patsy Sweeney in, you know, I feel like it might have happened the same night that Cannoli and Britt fought on the other coast. Is it November 20th? I can't remember off the top of my head. I've too many dates in my notes that I've been doing the editing.
Let me see. I'm looking here
but Langford stopped Patsy Sweeney, and I think it was the same night. It was close to it.
Yeah, it might have been. November 20th was the Cannoli fight.
Yeah, check Langford's thing if it's not inconvenient. I know they don't have that many common opponents, but
Langford had a
Yeah,
crazy amount
so
of fights, you know. What I'm saying?
yeah, so that overshadowed Langford's win, but Langford stopped Patsy Sweeney, which was heavy duty, and he beat him up real good, and stopped him in the 12th. But I think that was the same night that Cannoli, when it was fighting over on
Yeah,
the other
you're right.
coast.
November 20th,
Oh, look at
1903.
that! Look who suddenly got a
Yeah, all
memory.
the way.
Yeah, I've
Look
been
at that.
hitting a lot of dates doing this
Yeah,
editing
random.
down these champions.
I had a bell or something I could ring right now. Just major props right there. Crazy.
Oh, well, it's in the book. It's in the book. I don't always reference other fights that are happening, but guys like Britt, Gans, the great Joe Walcott, the welterweight champion, got to mention them because, as a lot of your listeners already know, there are not too many weight classes in this time. And even if you count colored and white claimants and disputed claimants, like at one point Jack O'Brien and Tommy Ryan were claiming the middleweight honors, and Fitz was in there saying he never lost it, accurately pointing out he never lost it at the limit. So, you got.
Yeah. No, he didn't. Technically, yeah, he didn't.
Yeah, so but even counting all of that, there's not too many champions compared to today. Even if there was disputed titles, like at heavyweight, Jim Jeffries was drawing the color line, so there was color champion, heavyweight champs. So you had two champs. But that worked in reverse too. When Gans was the world lightweight champion, you had white champions. When Joe Walcott was the world champion, but largely fighting heavyweights at one point, he had like a run of heavyweight fights because he was out of his mind. Joe Walcott was incredible. But you had white welterweight claimants. So cuts both ways, in this time, as you know, like if you couldn't get the world title, you could claim like the American title or the title of your region or the coast you were on. You could make a claim and then you just put money behind it and it becomes important and people would fight and it boiled down and then the press would acknowledge that you were the contender. Langford did it himself. He claimed the American welterweight championship and put some forfeit money up after Joe Walcott shot himself in the hand. I think that was October in 1904. He just claimed it, and that's how it went. Sometimes, there's no commissions unless you count the National Sporting Club in England. There's no real commission setting the rules and the weight classes. So I see in the papers in this time where they're trying to have meetings and set up a national commission. I mean, you don't even have it today, but they were trying that over, like 120 years ago. They were trying to do it then.
It's insane. Just
set the weights.
Just the magnitude of the amount of things that were going on during those days is just interesting. And yes, Joe Walcott shot himself in the hand. The original Barbados Joe Walcott, former world welterweight champion, first black welterweight champion, shot himself in the hand. You wonder, like, how would a boxer manage to allow something like that to happen? But hey, shit happens, I guess you can say. It's just one of those crazy things.
From what I read, he was known to carry a gun around, in the ring or otherwise. Probably not a bad idea. He wasn't necessarily a popular champ. From the way they wrote about him, Walcott was a guy people would show up hoping he would lose, but he was too good, and a lot of the guys his own size were scared of him. So, because he really was a very intimidating person. Walcott was a fiery character, right? So,
man, a little beast. That's one of the fighters. If I had a list of the fighters I want to most see on film, between him and Harry Greb, those are probably my top two right there. Between the two of them, but certainly, John L. Sullivan's up there as well. But that's another story there in itself, But
I'd like to see Walcott fighting Big Sandy Ferguson. He fought that in
insane.
At the Criterion. Big Sandy had like 50 pounds on him. He was 6'3" was what they said. Walcott was about 5'1".
5'1", folks. We have a champion, Nick Ball, in the featherweight division these days. He's 5'1", so he's like a wrecking ball, and that's no pun intended, but I guess you could argue a pun could be intended with it, but he's literally that. I mean, he just comes with it. Offensively, he's just there in your grill, and he's nonstop with what he's doing, and man, he's had so much success that it just goes to show, sometimes, as the saying goes, is the size of the fight in the dog as opposed to the actual size of the dog, and that's what I attribute to Nick Ball here in modern times, as well as the great Barbados Joe Walcott. Real quick though, Random, I want to shout out those that have dropped in here in the meantime. Shout out to my man Paul Bright. Says salute Josh there, Paul Bright, my fellow Marine right there. Simplify. Hey, hold your head strong there, Paul Bright. veterans continuing to hold it down. So salute there to you, my fellow Marine brethren right there. Paul Bright, good stuff there. Great to have you in the mix there, buddy, as always. Shout out to Josh Taylor here. So salute, my friend. Salute there to you, buddy. Josh Taylor. Be sure to check him out, folks, as well. Josh Taylor, always great to have you here, sharing knowledge and all that good stuff that is tied to it. Josh says Nelson was a true fighter, no doubt about it. Joe Gans was a great fighter. Yes, indeed. And the two are connected. Shout out to my man, Just Boz in the mix here. Be sure to follow Boz's Boxing, B-O-Z, apostrophe S Boxing. That's the channel that we tend to connect on here from a boxing standpoint. But Boz is in the mix. He said, salute just came from Bruce's trivia show. So, oh, yeah, salute to Bruce. I saw that he was live.
Bruce.
Salute to him. Yeah. I saw that he was live. Yeah, I would have liked to have been a part of that. That's pretty cool, though. He did a little bit earlier than typical. So, but good stuff either way. Just Boz mentions, must admit, I wasn't familiar with Britt. Hey, a lot of people aren't there, Boz. Hey, that's why we're here. And we got the great Random Acoustic Thoughts in the mix here to help us out. Shout out to Rusty Cage. Says salute. Salute there to you, Rusty Cage. Always great to have you here. We're talking Jimmy Britt. Paul Bright again, much love there to you. And then shout out to my man Chris, representing Irish Boxing. He's the representative here as far as this channel is concerned. So salute there to you, Chris. Says keep her lid, lads. Good stuff right there, representing those fighting Irish right there. Real quick, but yeah, no, appreciate all of you being here again. 86 Boxing, Random Acoustic Thoughts. We are here. We are talking about the great Jimmy Britt. Jimmy Britt, who is a fighter who is often not mentioned because I think a lot of people just do not know of him. And when you think about limited resumes from an official fight count perspective, man, something serious and tough amongst his resume. We've talked about some of the fights that he's already been a part of. I'll pull this back up again. Some of those notable fights that he's been a part of. Just think about this. Think about having 4 fights, and within your first 4 fights, you fighting the likes of Frank Aaron and George Kid Levine. Just it's crazy. It's crazy just to think about that. They're random, but wanted to share something just insane.
Yeah, so and his claim was strongest, I think, at the even in spite of the DQ loss and the draw with O'Keefe, heading into the 1904 season, because he'd beaten Cannoli, and that was a big win. So even the Boston papers were like, sometimes call him the champ, especially right before the fight. You know, would be fighting someone for the white championship. They'll just say fighting for the championship. Because there's rival claims, you know, and it's Gans, you know, most people would point out, yeah, Gans, until he loses it, he's the guy, right? Until he definitely can't make the limit. And he ended up making the limit, so it kind of settled that. But heading into 1904, because Blackburn in a 6-rounder and Langford in a 15-rounder had gotten the best of Gans, even though they weren't title fights. Well, if Blackburn had stopped Gans, he would have been able to claim the title, but it wasn't to a decision, so he could only win it by a knockout. Knockouts always counted, pretty much, unless you were outside the weight catch weights. So he comes in, but then he beats the featherweight champion, Young Corbett II, another great fighter. But Corbett was the 122-pound champion, but he had spent a while now fighting above the limit for the title, and they fought at 130 pounds. So even though Britt now claimed to be the featherweight champion, he didn't really get recognition from the press, because this was at a time when they started, I believe, recognizing Abe Attell as a featherweight champion. Because again, like with Britt at lightweight, Attell could make the limit, and if you got too big, they didn't always wait for you to admit that you were too big. They just stopped recognizing you. So I think that's kind of what happened with the featherweight title. But he did beat Corbett, who was a very serious guy and who had been fighting up close to at least halfway or more toward the lightweight limit from featherweight. So he wasn't like a tiny person. The whole thing was he wasn't tiny. It was like the weight question was how they called it. But that was a big fight, and that actually led Britt. That points win got Britt in there. He withdrew his color line objection at some point. They worked out all the details, and he fought Gans. He was doing good in that fight. That was October 04. He was doing good in that fight, but he got overzealous. The ref afterwards said, I'm trying to remember who the ref was. I got it written somewhere. Eddie Graney said that he had to DQ him. He should have DQ'd him in the 4th. for hitting Gans when he was down, but then he let it go because no damage was done. I think he missed or just grazed him, but then he did it again in the 5th. So even though he was winning the fight, he was on his way to what looked like a good victory. He screwed it up for himself, and they were pretty merciless about it. They weren't like, "Oh, he won in spirit." No, he screwed it up. He was mad at himself. His supporters were mad, but so that was Gans getting down to the limit, proving he wasn't too big for the class because they were calling him a welt. It was very racist as well. So like there were double standards. Like they were instantly on Gans the way they hadn't been on Young Corbett II. Later, it took a while with Corbett. He had to really push the limits, fighting at like 130 pounds, 128, 130. They didn't give Gans any leeway. So when he made the limit, even though he won on a DQ, he got a lot of credit for that. And then they were like, okay, you got to beat him. He's the guy to beat. But Britt wasn't done. You know, he fought battling Nelson after that. That's quite a lineup for a year.
The
3 fights.
And I just want to know,
Gans, Nelson.
Hey, real quick, I just want to note, for the people that don't know, Joe Gans, his career started in 1893. So he was already, I guess you can consider a wily veteran, 10 plus years in at that particular time, you know?
Yeah, and he was Gans might have been the winningest active fighter in the sport at that point. I mean, a huge resume, tremendous experience, had chased the title for years and years. So when he finally got into 02, Gans was already a somebody. He was a big deal. It's just, as a colored fighter, you just, you know, and maybe some of it's like the white press better preserved, and it's easier to access the way they were written to. But also those papers had bigger budgets to get writers to fights and things like that. And it was so it's like the coverage might be a bit skewed, but you know, coverage counts, and Britt had a lot of press behind him, especially on the West Coast. And it was a fight mecca out there. That's where the big purses were. There were other cities you could make a lot of money, but he was in the spot, so to speak, fighting out on the West Coast at that time with the backing he had. But he had a heck of a
And real quick, Random, I just want to note before we move past this, the magnitude of that win over Young Corbett II, one of the great fighters of this generation or this particular period in time frame there. Young Corbett II actually coming into that contest was far and beyond the wily veteran in this particular fight. He was 55-5-11, and he had already won a world title by that point. So just think about that. This is still a limited amount of total fights for Jimmy Britt. So that's just something essentially amazing.
Yeah, and then doing so well against Gans, even though he messed it up, but doing so well until that point to the DQ. And then he beats battling Nelson on points, 20 rounds, again in the same venue, Mechanics Pavilion in San Fran. Billy Roach is the ref this time, but so he gets the win, so he's kind of back because Nelson, there was a lot of steam behind him. So he closed out 1904 on a high point, even though he lost to Gans. But, you know, wins over Corbett and Nelson, he's still a money guy. And then I'm pretty sure his first opponent in 1905, that was in May, he fought Jabez White, who I think was the English lightweight champion, claimant, or actual. He fought him again, at Woodward's Pavilion, where he'd beaten Young Corbett. And then he fought and beat Kid Sullivan in the same venue. And then at the Mission Street Arena in Colmo that you mentioned, I think you mentioned that, he lost to battling Nelson. The rematch, got knocked out in the 18th. That was it for his 1905. But again, he's fighting. I mean, Kid Sullivan may not have been quite at the level of the other guys, but two of those three fighters, you know, they're claimants of the championship. Nelson wanted that championship, and he certainly claimed it after he beat Britt. So even though they couldn't get past Gans necessarily yet, Gans was still too good, even though he was, some people would call him an old-timer or not a has-been because he was a champion, but just saying he was past it. Like when Langford got the best of him especially, but that Blackburn, they were extra harsh on Gans. He didn't get a lot of leeway, not just because he was a black fighter, but also because they hated his manager. They really did. Like when Gans left his manager and got a California manager / promoter, I'm pretty sure it was, the praise started rolling in. The tide turned. So Gans started getting his proper credit. Also because of his fight results. Gans was an incredibly special fighter, but Oh, sorry, 86. It broke up a bit. I don't know if it's you or me.
Me there. Technical difficulties here for a sec, folks. It looks like I'm
hear you
getting
now.
it back right here. Hopefully you can hear me
Yeah,
real
you're
quick.
back. Sorry about it.
Okay,
86.
good to go. Good to go. Hopefully people can still see this. Okay, cool. Hopefully, yeah. I broke up a little bit. Thank you for mentioning such. Hopefully people can still hear. Looks like we're back up right there. So yeah, you can pick up where you left off there, Random.
Yeah, so I mean, so coming into 1906, he's got the loss to Nelson, but he's still a big name. I mean, one of the top names in the sport. Like lightweight class, there was a lot of prestige on that class. As I mentioned earlier, there weren't too many weight classes, and among them lightweight, partly because Jim Jeffries was, while simultaneously drawing the color line, he was claiming there was no one worthy to fight him. But of course, he was like ruling out a large portion of the top heavyweights by drawing the color line. So the press went along with it. Again, it was a racist time. He got a pass. Like he was not a willing fella in that he would fight all comers. And same with Britt. You know, like a lot of these guys, it's not just today where people are selective. Plenty of examples back then. It's just that back then you also had examples of people who would fight a tremendous schedule and weren't that picky about the particulars. Like they wouldn't always demand all these special concessions and stuff. Or then you have like Gans, who fought a busy schedule, but his manager was very demanding. So actually making the Britt Gans battles happen was not easy. They had some, and actually Langford, they had some heated newspaper discussions, is the way they put it, at the offices of the Post to with Al Hereford and Joe Woodman, Langford's manager, to secure the Gans Langford match at the end of 1903. That one wasn't easy either. It took a couple days of haggling, and they ended up fighting above the limit. They wouldn't make the fight at 133. They wanted it at 138. So,
oh yeah.
So maybe if there was a loss,
with weights, of course, and I know we mentioned a little bit earlier, but yeah, that weight haggling been around for a long period of time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There were a lot of big fights that didn't happen because they just couldn't agree on the catch weights. The larger fighter couldn't make the weight that the smaller, if he was a bigger draw, was demanding. So there's plenty of that going around. It's not new. It's just a lot of that fades over time, and it doesn't get reported because you're distilling down these whole massive careers into a few talking points. That is not the most interesting thing about all these great fighters of the distant past, but there was plenty of drama. But then in 1906, Britt has a really big fight. He fights at Madison Square Garden, and he fights terrible Terry McGovern. And you've done some stuff for McGovern. You want to talk a little bit about that little badass guy?
Yeah, former world featherweight champion, of course, terrible Terry McGovern. And as a matter of fact, it just so happens two of the fighters that we've already, well, including him, we've mentioned here in the midst of this video, which shows you the sort of mind-boggling magnitude of the resume of a Jimmy Britt, is the fact that, yeah, terrible Terry McGovern. I recently did a video here, I think it was last week, as a matter of fact, on Joe Gans versus terrible Terry McGovern fight that took place in, I want to say it was 1900. I forget I think it was December 8th, 1900 might have been, but could be off. But in 1900, and one of the fights that is widely considered a fix, but could have not been a fix. You know, there are some that view it as not being a fix, but it got fighting banned in the state of Illinois for around 26 years. That just shows you it was pretty crazy, but it's happened in Chicago. So terrible Terry McGovern taking on Joe Gans. So he knocked out Gans in that particular contest. We are lucky enough to have it on film. Just thinking about that, 100 plus years and beyond, or 100 years and beyond, 100 plus years, we have video footage of some of these great fighters. So terrible Terry McGovern, not only just Gans, but he just had pretty impressive resume, one of the big punchers of the sport. I don't know the full particulars of the ring 100 greatest fighters, but I'd imagine when they did that back in whatever year it was that they last conducted, I'm pretty sure Terry McGovern had to be on there, but just one of the big time punchers. He's not a huge guy, 5'3", small featherweight. He started beyond that, or at least below those weights. It just shows you the magnitude, him rising up taking on the likes of a Joe Gans, a lightweight, and McGovern, something special there. One of the great nicknames as well, Terrible Terry McGovern right there. So we've heard some other terribles in the sport right here, but you got to definitely give nods Terrible Terry there for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was not every fight, but he was a finishing machine. So he exploded onto the scene. Once he got hit his stride, Terrible Terry was a huge star. So this was a big fight between big names. That was the East Coast fight, so something a little different for Britt. But they drew. It was a no decision, so it was 10 rounds. But I think it was like all the papers called it a draw. Like it was like if I'm thinking of the right fight, it was like a unanimous newspaper decision draw. Sometimes you'd have one paper going one way or the other against the majority, but so we can say they fought even. Two great fighters here. But that was it for 1906. But in 07,
hey, hold on, real quick, Random, and I need to box real quick. I want to, but before we move from McGovern, I just want to mention this one thing here. I had to pull up the box rec. So, Terrible Terry McGovern, at that particular time that Britt fought him, let's see here, he was 66-5-4. Think about that, 66-5-4. And let me tell you the case with Britt. So Jimmy Britt, 11-3-1. Just think about that, folks. 11-3-1 for Jimmy Britt. Terrible Terry McGovern, who'd been a champion at this point. 66-5-4. And you can proceed there, Randall.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, Britt was fighting above his experience level, but he was a heck of a fighter. Color line politics and all that other stuff aside, he got in some big fights. So there are different reasons fighters avoid each other or put stipulations that limit their opponent list. But what was left on his list was very impressive. So something to remember about this time, like guys, obviously drawing the color line is disgraceful, and we would see it as sort of a yellow thing to do, but doesn't mean that was the only place to find fights. It just meant it limited the overall pool, because there were colored fighters who were denied opportunity, but they still fought an incredibly strong level of competition amongst people with their own skin tone, because fighters are fighters, people are people. But it's just when you limit the pool of, whether you do it or someone does it to you, when you limit your pool of opposition, it takes a lot to keep a high level of opponent in there, because you've cut out a big chunk of the potential opponents. But Britt, he got it on. He just didn't fight very often. Looks more like a modern career, right? 3 fights in 05, 1 fight in 06, 2 fights in 07. Look at you, Jimmy Britt. He fit right in today, fighting, although he's fighting at a really high level here. Like, not a lot of filler here. 1907, another fight with Battling Nelson, wins it this time on points. Now he's back on top. Now he's the other guy. And then he gets the fight with Joe Gans. That's in July. And then September 9th, he fights Joe Gans. And this time TKO'd in the 6th. I think it was he claimed an arm injury, was it?
For Gans?
No, in the loss to Joe Gans, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I think Britt claimed an arm injury in the 6th round.
They say he potentially broke his wrist or injured his wrist in some capacity, wrist, arm, something tied to that, as you mentioned there for sure. And the world lightweight title was technically considered to be on the line there at ringside, because it was at 133 pounds and both made that weight, which is crazy, right?
Yeah, and Gans was repeatedly showing that, whether he could have before, if he had to diet and refocus to make the weight, but he showed that he could make the weight. So after the second fight with Britt, Gans, the papers were raving about him. Basically, you could find quite a few people saying, this is the greatest lightweight that ever lived. There were already people who had said that, but by the time Gans beat Britt again, and this time, not as controversially, because some of the papers were making fun of Britt, suggesting maybe that he was just trying not to get stopped. I'm not saying that's what happened, but that's what some people were saying. It was a lot, they like drama then as now, so that's partly what some people were saying. But yeah, so part of Gans' legend is tied into his victories, especially the second one over Jimmy Britt. and the fight with Battling Nelson. So like Battling Nelson, because he was the one to dethrone Gans and eventually became the man, he's more remembered than Britt. He also had a larger body of work, but they did have that rivalry, and it didn't go all Battling Nelson's way. So that's important to remember. We think about championships in this time, people could fight champions and win, maybe not become the champion or get the fame that comes along with it, but they'd have the win. Just like Langford beat Gans at the same weight that Gans fought, Barbados Walcott practically however many months later, September of 1904. So 9 months later. So it's not like Gans would never fight anyone who was 140 pounds, because Walcott was 141. They were both 141 for that fight, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So again, weight games, sometimes they were selective. Certain guys had to make a limit, and other guys, it wasn't a problem. So it's very interesting texture, but it's certainly good to keep in mind that it wasn't all clean and pristine and everything was noble and, chivalry was still alive. And no. The fight game has always been the fight game. It's just that different times you have different people screwing up the works, but it's always been difficult to pull off fights, especially in this time period. So,
and if you see it today, they learned it from the past for sure.
That's right.
We sometimes get this thought, and we become prisoners of the moment here in modern times. But trust me when I tell you, there's absolutely nothing when we talk about the physical, the boxing, the technique standpoint that we see today that hasn't been done or seen in the past. I want to just say that. And when you think about some of the crazies, the anomalies, they have happened in the past. And if you dive through the history, I think you'll understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. Including claimed injuries that are or aren't always accurate, or that they're not quite what was said. Like after Walcott and Joe Gans famously fought in 1904, Walcott claimed, like, it was some of the papers the day after in California were saying, oh, he broke his arm and stuff. But it turned out he had sort of, I think, severed a ligament or something in his wrist. Mm-hmm. And it might have been a re-injury from training and also from previous fights, because he'd had some injuries before in his long career. But you can find contemporary reporting saying, oh, he broke his arm in different ways and stuff. So, sometimes that's why I researched broadly, to just try and get all the different things that are being said. And then you kind of notice the outlier statements. And sometimes it's good to get the news right away. But then sometimes a week later is when the truth comes out, like especially medical stuff. Once they've been examined by a physician, they've actually been treated. And so, yeah, it takes a bit to figure out what was going on. But it was definitely crazy then, just like it's crazy now.
Yeah, crazy times, for sure. No, real quick, I'm here with Random Acoustic Thoughts. Folks, go check him out at Random Acoustic Thoughts. YouTube.com/@Random Acoustic Thoughts. I'm dropping it in the chat right now. Be sure to go like, subscribe right now. Go check out his content. This is only just a small glimpse into it, because he gets into some of the intricate details of some of these great fighters here. And again, we're talking the great Jimmy Britt. Jimmy Britt, who would have competed amongst the greatest contenders and above of any era and time frame. When you look at what he was able to do in only 23 official fights, in terms of what we have recorded, only 23 official fights, and some of the opponents he went up against. So Random Acoustic Thoughts and I are discussing this great fighter for sure.
Thanks for the shout out, Josh City. Yeah, and Britt was a big deal, so he may not be a fighter where there's like unknown bouts unless he fought in private or something. Simply because he was a big deal as an amateur, and when he turned pro, it was a big deal. So he was in the spotlight from day one because of his unique circumstances. But there are plenty of other fighters where things were much more complex, and there's much more like Battling Nelson may have had way more fights because he wasn't always in that top position. But Britt was one of those guys who's a modern version, or a more modern version. Ray Leonard, when he came out, he was already a big deal. Different reason, but he was already a big deal. Like, you weren't going to sneak in a Ray Leonard fight and no one would notice, because he's making money from day one. So it was a little bit like that with Britt, but I can't say for certain. I'm not claiming to know for sure. with him, but it's just the texture of his career. It may be possible that he really had that few fights, certainly in his heyday. Maybe later when he went to England, maybe he had other fights that didn't, for one reason or another, or in private, where, you know, because sometimes nobles, people of the royal family, and this and that might be at a bout, and they keep that on the hush. Or if there were photos, they suppress them. So yeah, it's possible that he could have gone over there and done some stuff, but he wasn't done. He wasn't done in the States. He actually fought Battling Nelson again in 1908 in March, and to a 10-round no decision. This was in LA, where they didn't allow a decision. So if both men were on their feet, then at the end of the fight, it was just there was no official winner. That was a way that certain jurisdictions tried to clamp down on betting. So people would, you know, naturally, they just gamble on what the newspaper men said, who were prominent at the time. But it did mean that, yeah, it was a little difficult to figure out who was and wasn't the champ with the whole no decision era. You've done plenty of content on that.
Oh yeah,
86. But then he also fights the next month in April, just a little bit over a month later. He fights Packy McFarland, who you mentioned, who according to BoxRec was 50-1 at the time. He loses to McFarland, but it looks like an awful lot of people lost to McFarland, who we know to be a great fighter. So I don't think there's any shame in that. And it's just him still fighting at an incredibly high level. And I got to say, in BoxRec, they have the ref as Jack Welsh, but I think his name was Welch with a CH at the end. So I think that's the same ref that refereed the Joe Walcott, Joe Gans fight, because they fought on the West Coast. So I think that, so on BoxRec, you know, sometimes they do a great job, but sometimes stuff's a little bit off for one reason or another. So I think that's Welch, the referee. Unless there were two guys rolling around in those high-level fights, not very likely. And then at the end of the year, he's in the UK and he fights Johnny Summers, who I don't know if you know anything about Johnny Summers, of like any distinction he had, but he beats him the first time they fight, and then in 1909 they fight twice more, and he loses twice. Loses on points over 20 rounds at the National Sporting Club, the main venue of the UK, and then he loses somewhere, Memorial Grounds in Canning Town. I don't know if that's a section of London or a suburb or what, but so yeah, so he closes out. He goes out on a couple losses, it looks like, to a guy he had just beaten the year before. So, and that wraps up Jimmy Britt. It's really not that many fights. It feels like a modern career, right? Like a short modern career, like a Lomachenko style deal with just not a lot of fights, but a lot of high level fights. So yeah, I think he's a guy that deserves respect for his abilities, with the caveat that at times he was evasive with certain matchups, like a lot of guys have been. There aren't too many guys floating around who would just fight anyone, anywhere, under any conditions throughout history. I mean, everyone had certain things they needed or required, or weight considerations and things, to a point at least. But yeah, Britt got it in, man, and he did really well, and he made a pile of money. And interestingly, there's 3 videos of Sam Langford, fight videos, that survive. One of them at the Olympia, which was Australian promoter Hugh McIntosh's new club in London, February of 1911. Jimmy Britt is the master of ceremonies. He's either still over in England or he's gone back to England, but he was actually there in a tux, playing MC to Hugh McIntosh's big promotion. So he does tie into Langford's career in a small way, as well as being a rival of Gans, who was, you know, one of Langford's rivals. Gans and Langford almost rematched probably 6 months after they actually fought, but it didn't come together. The weight question. Langford couldn't make 138 again, and so they called it off. Gans fought a guy, young Kid Griffo, not the Australian Kid Griffo. This was a guy from Brooklyn. He stopped him in, I think, 7 or 8 rounds. Yeah. What's up, Technique?
Great night and note right there. Yeah, thanks, Random. Yeah, salute that to you. Technique holding it down right there. Then also 4-ring 8P. Salute there to you. 4-ring 8P. But Kid Griffo, a great fighter right there. Random, man, you had mentioned Packy McFarland. There's a video on the channel on the great Packy McFarland. It's an hour. Sit down and watch the entire hour. I think you'll actually enjoy it, because it really dives into the history of and shares some love on the great Packy McFarland. who is one of the premier fighters to have competed in the sport there at lightweight. So in and around the same weight class and time frame, you know what I'm saying? It's crazy that Jimmy Britt fought him and Packer McFarlane. Once you watch the video on the channel, I think you'll really understand how great of a fighter he is and was right there. So, man,
special.
That.
Yeah, and some guys, they don't get necessarily the world titles, but you see, if you look at the Hall of Fame website, you look at some of the names, you'd be like, well, what makes him special? I never heard of him holding the title. Well, there are plenty of guys out there. The Gibbons brothers are some of the most famous examples. Tommy and Mike Gibbons, great fighters, great resumes, great win-loss records, really, really quality fighters who made a lot of money, just didn't end up with a world title. But some of these guys, they have limited opportunities. So today, maybe you don't get a title, so you fight for one of the parallel titles that's vacant because someone moved up, because there are so many weight classes, it's easy to move up 4 or 5 pounds. You go back far enough, there aren't too many places to go, and certain guys, they may be excellent, but when they move up, they don't necessarily carry the same pop. Terry McGovern, featherweight, absolute killer.
Yes.
A lightweight, an elite lightweight, but not an absolute world-destroying crusher. And so it happened to Young Corbett II. It's tougher when you move up, especially when there aren't many weight classes. So if you're a featherweight and you join the lightweight ranks, you are joining absolute wall-to-wall killers, because it's so deep and there's not a lot of titles around. And so the titles, it's tricky when you get far enough to just go on championships or even championship claims. It gets very complicated. Just lots of examples of perhaps where people like win big fights for one reason or another, no title at stake, but they still beat that guy, and they're still fighting an era where people gave up weight. So it's not like you say, oh, he had 4 pounds on him. It's not a real win. No, it's a win. I mean, it happens today where one guy's rehydrating 12 pounds more than the other, and he's in a whole separate weight class, or maybe 2 on occasion. Or we saw great fighters like Duran just straight up give up the weight, and not always get crushed. That's partly why he's held in such high esteem, because in some of his famous performances, he was clearly the smaller man, but he was the aggressor. He was hurting the other guy. But sometimes those things aren't always remembered equally for different things, because Muhammad Ali, he hurt George Foreman long before he stopped him. He hurt him in the earlier rounds. I think it was the 4th round. He hurt him real good. It wasn't just some one-sided fight.
Random, we've talked about that before. The thought, or sort of the story, is that George Foreman was just having his way with Muhammad Ali, but it's actually the contrast. Ali was giving him a hell of a fight there. You could argue
it was a good fight. It was a good fight, and it wasn't one that was invisible to people. He coined the wonderful phrase, or he popularized it, whichever. Obviously he deserves credit because he was in there doing it, and the public did feel, and the press and the pundits did feel like he was overmatched, like it was going to be bad for him. But the fight itself, I like watching that fight because, Muhammad Ali, he was smaller. Yeah, he wasn't known for the power, but he wasn't that much smaller. He wasn't a tiny guy. It's not like when he was a little teenager and he's whatever, light heavyweight sized guy. He's a real heavyweight. He's a big fella. And you look at Ali, same with Joe Louis, not a huge heavyweight, but he had a heavyweight sized head. He wasn't some pointy chinned little guy. You can just tap him on the chin. It's good night. Muhammad Ali, Joe Louis, those guys had a real dome on them. Look at some of those interviews with older Joe Louis and hear how deep his voice is. He was a big fella. It's just that these guys were trained down, boil themselves down.
No doubt about it. Yeah, these were legit. They were actually legit. Yeah, they were in the lower 200s, probably right there when you think about them in the absolute prime of their careers. The lower 200s, the 20-somethings here and there, give or take. But they could get above that, of course. And you're right there, Random. So that's one of the misconceptions. And we think about just because it's bigger doesn't mean it's better. Doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be able to handle something a bit smaller, because we've seen here, even in modern times, where some of the smaller heavyweights, by the standards of these 6'6" and up behemoths of this time, We've seen how some of them have been dethroned. Shout out to 4 Rings 8P, who says my all-time favorite boxer is Julio Cesar Chavez. Not many talk about his 89-0 before he lost, ages before middleweight. No, good stuff right there. 4 Rings 8P. No, great fighter right there. Mexican champion. Some argue and mention him being the greatest Mexican champion of all time, but I think that does factor in there for Ring. Yeah, great fighter. He didn't have an amateur career, so that being said, he worked his way up, learned on the job. 89-0, remarkable. You know,
I didn't know that. I didn't know that he didn't have an amateur career. That's very impressive. That's one of the things about Sam Langford is he had 3 amateur fights, and then for his next fight, he was fighting on a professional card. Well, he got kicked out of the amateurs. It's actually unclear if he got paid for that.
Yeah.
But he was fought at the Lennox Club, and the AAU kicked him out. Him and his opponent, Jack McVicker, they kicked them both out. So he turned pro. He effectively was turned pro by circumstances, but not much of an amateur preparation. Jimmy Britt was a little different because he had money. So he was training full-time the whole time he was an amateur, even though he didn't have a lot of competition. As an amateur, he had a lot of training, and he had the luxury of good quarters and good staff and stuff. Because he had stuff behind him, he had some backing. But he's not the only one. Other guys, not everyone was just broke for their whole life before joining the craft.
No problem. And then with Jimmy Britt, just speaking of the magnitude, one name we kind of skipped over was Willie Fitzgerald, who Jimmy Britt actually fought as well. And I definitely want to note Willie Fitzgerald, not a huge name that is out there in the sport. As a matter of fact, so Jimmy Britt fought him in what would have been his 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th fight, which is amazing. And he got a points victory over him. Fitzgerald fought a number of top-level names, but Harry Lewis, former world welterweight champion, among others. Let me look at this. Look at Fitzgerald's resume. So Jimmy Britt beat him in his 6th fight. Maurice Sayers, solid fighter right there. Let me see here. So Unc Russell.
Did he fight Matty Matthews?
Let me see if he fought Matthews.
That's one of the ones that Langford, it was booked and then it didn't happen. But he was supposed to fight Matty Matthews, the former welterweight champion at one point.
He may have let me see here. But yeah, Fitzgerald fought Joe Gans, Mike Twin Sullivan, just amazing name. So this gives you the magnitude of the names that these types of individuals. I don't see Matty on here.
Okay,
but
he was more of a natural welter. So
because we kind of glossed. We didn't mention him here previously, and that was the 6th fight of Jimmy Britt. So Jimmy Britt beat Fitzgerald. I mean, Joe Gans. Just think about that. There are so many great fighters from the past, and we were kind of speaking on this random here when we were chatting a couple of days ago. Just the fact that you get so many names lost because of the fact that time has passed a lot of these fighters by when you're talking 100 plus years. That being said, we even look at the age of where we are now, where we have more access than ever. And still, we don't know all of the fighters there that are competing, some of the things taking place. We see some of the names that rise up. So just imagine just the number of just top level, elite level fighters who would contend and compete in any eras that we miss out on just because boxing has such a storied history, and you can't latch on to every single one.
Yeah, there's so much. I mean, even if you just wanted to be an NFL historian, you're talking a lot, right? But that's a limited number of games per season, limited number of seasons. Boxing goes back way further in an organized form and was deeper and had more people participating, more matches, because it just takes 2 people to have a fight. There's so much that's undiscovered. And some of it's unknowable because the records just haven't survived. Newspapers didn't survive. Wasn't reported for one reason or another. Because, when boxing's under the ban in a city and the rich guys want to watch someone fight and bet on it in private, they're not going to go get themselves in trouble. Because even like in Boston in early 1904, January and February, when the police board were cracking down, guys were still fighting, but they weren't necessarily going to put everything in the press because Judge Emmons was trying to arrest people. That was the judge that arrested, that had the police arrest Choyinski and Kid Carter. Kid Carter, a really underrated he had a mixed record, but a really underrated career, really tough game fighter.
Yeah,
Joe
you can't just look at records.
Joe Walcott fought. Kid Carter was like a light heavyweight / heavyweight sized fighter. Joe Walcott, little old Joe, Joe the Giant Killer fought Kid Carter at the Criterion, and they had an amazing fight. And Walcott actually had his way for, I think it was 14 rounds, and then in the 15th, Kid Carter almost finished him and had him nearly out at the finish. Walcott got the decision, but it was like a celebrated fight. The Criterion Club, which is where Langford made his fame, that was a good club. It was just around for a couple of years. You know, it was a volatile time, but man, they put on some good fights there.
Yeah, and Kid Carter, beast. You can't let the record fool you, folks. You look at Kid Carter's record, it's going to be closer to 500, and don't let that fool you, though. It was really when you dive into some of those layers. Don't let the kind of recent times, modern times, of course, to be an undefeated fighter, a fighter with a limited amount of losses is very much stand out. But don't let that over or provide more of an emphasis or at least cloud judgment as it relates to just great fighters in general, because these individuals, man, there's something about experience. We talk about all the other things. You got athleticism, you have sort of that what you can build up from an IQ standpoint or whatever, but the experience that you gain from actually fighting fighters, other great fighters, other elite fighters, that's the one thing that I think you can probably put weight over more than anything in the sport of boxing. And that's why you have individuals with the likes of Sam Langford, Joe Gans, Jimmy Britt, for instance. That's why individuals of this nature stand out, is because all things aside, and say all things are equal, just that overall experience that you gain from being in with fighters who are at just that all-time elite level. I mean, that's something you just cannot replace.
Yeah, that's the truth, man. You know, and Britt, it's not a big career, but, you know, there are other fighters, Jim Jeffries. I won't get into it. I know we're going to wrap it up shortly, but there are other fighters who have a smaller resume from the distant past, but packed with tough competition. Even if they didn't fight everybody in their day, but they fought when they were fighting at a very high level. Britt's one of those guys, certainly not alone in that, but he had sort of a confluence of events where he was making a lot of money. There were a lot of reasons for the press to get really excited about a guy who was so popular, fighting popular guys in a popular, you know, venues. So yeah, it was an interesting character. I really appreciate you getting together, man, talking about it. It's been fun.
Hey, no, this has been great. No, the pleasure is most certainly mine here, Random. I appreciate you taking the time, you know, after putting in a day's work, taking the time to spend an hour plus here discussing boxing history in the midst of the work that you're doing on your own there. As he noted, folks, he has a book that will be coming out on the great Sam Langford. We don't have too many of those out there. Clay Moyle is a great book. And yes, of course, my man Random Acoustic Thought, he has consulted with Clay Moyle. They've been in contact, etc. So you know this is coming from a pure historic standpoint. So man, that right there is
Clay Moyle
right there, Random.
Yeah, and check out Clay's book on Sam Langford, boxing's greatest uncrowned champion, I think the title is. And incidentally, had some discussions with Clay, and it looks as though he'll be writing the foreword for the book. So when it's done, I know who's getting the first copy of the manuscript, so you get to work. But it'll be good. Yeah, I'm excited about it.
Here, folks, exclusive.
Yeah, so it's exciting. I'm excited right now. That's why I haven't put a ton of stuff on my channel. I was doing a whole series on Langford, you know, the anniversary of his different fights, but it was too much work, and I just couldn't do it and do the book. So I've sort of boiled myself down. Like tomorrow, I don't have to work. I'm gonna put 10 hours in on this thing. Got to do it. It's the only way to get it done. It's an inordinate amount of time, but it's worth it. You know that at 86, you put out a ton of content. It takes time. You really got to invest the hours. There's no way around it.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes, hey, that's what it comes down to right there. Hey, I try, my man. There, I try, you know. And at the end of the day, it's for the benefit of us all, and that's just from those that are here to view, listen, see what is going on in the world of history. Those that are here to share, comment, like, provide some insight towards those that may be in the background, those that might not say anything, who are viewing, watching, and learning and understanding. Either way, it all contributes to this great history, this great boxing history. That when you really boil it down, especially when you're going back 100 plus years, what we're talking about, there's not too many out there that are shedding light on such, and that's why we appreciate every single one of you who take the time to step in, listen to us, share some of that knowledge, share some of that love, and just even be here. Your presence alone, hey, it's a driver for us doing this thing, because at the end of the day, history is for the living. And what we're doing is we're just trying to share as much of that collectively and join in on as much of that as we can. So it's been a great thing, Random. And yeah, such a pleasure to have you here again, folks. YouTube.com/ at Random Acoustic Thoughts. Let me pull it up on the screen once again, at Random Acoustic Thoughts. And I would not recommend him if he wasn't worthy of recommendation. And if I could say,
you're very kind, 86. Hey, and tell the people, folks at home one more time where they can go to get that excellent shirt you're wearing.
oh, you can probably see it on the channel, all that stuff right here. You know what I'm saying?
Love it.
That being said, check
What's
out
the name of your store, Josh?
It's the 86 Boxing Spread Shop store. 86boxing.spread shop. I think that's
Spread Shop, folks. Go visit that. I'm gonna have to go make a visit myself. That Blackburn is speaking to me.
And look at mine. It's sharp right there. Sharp. Hey,
You're cold, man. That's a hard man. That sure to make you give you superpowers, make you invincible.
Hey, you know, we might have to dedicate a show just speaking on Jack Blackburn.
Hey, we can do a Blackburn show. Hey, 86, I want to mention one last thing that I know you got to go.
Oh, yeah.
So, folks, I recently came into possession. An old friend of mine gave me some copies of Classic Ring and KO magazine. And I think 86 and myself, I think we're going to do a giveaway or two. Some of them are going to go as gifts to people, but I think I got some set aside. So some of those, like the late 70s, early 80s, you think of Leonard and Duran and Hagler and these guys. This is, you know, so they're in some of those. So we're going to maybe do a thing or have a contest, best comment on maybe our next talk or something, where the winner will get a magazine. We'll mail you out a Classic Ring magazine. Because I'm not really a collector type, so I just want to place them with people who will enjoy them. Because it's not like my area, and I know you're more an old school guy yourself, 86. We talked about it, so maybe we'll get it out to the people, some sort of giveaway or contest. I just wanted to throw that in, folks. We appreciate you so much. Thanks for joining us, and thank you, 86, for hanging out, man. This was cool.
Oh no! As mentioned, the pleasure is mine. There, Random. So you see it there on the screen, folks. YouTube.com/ at Random Acoustic Thoughts. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say be sure to visit 86boxing.com to get this book, or at least sign up to be one of the random entries for this book by the great Mark Allen Baker on Jack Dillon, the Giant Slayer. Who's your Bearcat? Great fighter right there. And he'll be on the channel at some point here in the near term by the end of this month. And we're going to talk about this great fighter right here. But yeah, as mentioned there, Random Acoustic Talk, it's been an absolute pleasure. And we will be coming back, folks. So you will just check the channel, just check the actual live stream section, because you will know once it actually is getting ready to go down there. But again, check out youtube.com/ at Random Acoustic Thoughts. And I thank you once again there, Random, and I hope you enjoy your night there, Random, and everyone else definitely enjoy your night, and we will catch up with you on the flip side there, folks. Cheers.
All right, peace.